If we've ever had a relative, a grandmother, grandfather who said, trust your gut, trust your intuition, that's so important right now. I've been really thinking about the importance of interoception. That's a term that has been around for many years, but is getting more popularized. Our inner knowing. 80% of the information that travels the vagus nerve to the brain travels from the belly up, from the dorsal pathway up to the ventral. Only 20% is brain down. That's a very simplistic way to describe it. But to me, what that says is our deepest wisdom is inside of us, right? It's in that deep, intuitive belly brain. So I'm encouraging people to get to know that, to listen, to trust. Trust can be hard for many people for so many reasons, but to learn to listen to ourselves.
Hey, my friends, this is Nishant and welcome to another episode of the Nishant Garg Show. My mission is to help people get in touch with their emotions and feelings, connect to themselves and being a source of healing. My job on this show is to invite the world-class experts to deconstruct the practices, routines, and habits to help you live a fulfilled and abundant life. If you have been an active listener, I want to thank you and would love to connect with you sometime. So please email me if you are interested. You can find my email on my website. I put in so much effort in the show. And if you like learning from this platform, would you be please willing to spread the word about it when you see someone looking for podcast recommendations, or if you see someone wanting to make some changes in their life? By sharing a word about the show will mean so much to me, and thank you so much in advance. Today's guest is Dr. Amber Elizabeth Gray. Dr. Amber is a licensed human rights psychotherapist, innovative movement artist, board-certified dance movement therapist, master trainer and educator, continuum teacher and public health professional, an innovator in the use of somatic psychology, eco-somatics, and movement-based therapies, which includes dance movement therapy, yoga, continuum, with survivors of trauma, torture, war, and human rights abuses. She has spent the last 23 years in service of her belief that every human being has the right to inhabit their body in the way they choose. She has provided clinical training on the integration of refugee mental health and torture treatment with the creative arts, mindfulness, and body-based therapies. This episode really gets interesting. Please be patient. In this episode, we explore movement-based therapies, restoration and healing, different ceremonies for healing, somatic psychology, polyvagal theory, different modes of therapy, and much, much more. So without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Amber. Amber, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nishant. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to be here with you as well. And in the preparation of this conversation, I read that your father used to say, Amber was born dancing, fighting, and she has never stopped. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on your dancing as a teenager or as a young adult?
I'll share my first recollection of dancing. And before that, I don't remember exactly what my father meant by that. He surprised the heck out of me when he said that. It was a school assignment when I got my degree in dance therapy and somatic psychology. And I had to interview both parents about my birth. But I know he waited 24 hours and talked about how all these other fathers were coming and going with their new babies, and had some conversations with the doctor who kept saying, this child does not want to be born yet. And I have a sense that we shouldn't push her. She's gonna come out when she's ready. I don't know if I wiggled a lot or something, but that was his recollection of that time, my birth. And I remember as a little girl, before high school, before teen years, probably maybe as early as 8, that we would go to Cape Cod back when it was much more desolate and much less inhabited, wonderful coastal landscape there, and stay in these little cabins. And I loved to dance to the sound of the ocean and to the texture of the wind on my skin. So I would sneak out in the middle of the night and go stand at the ocean's edge. I had to cross a street, a little street. I remember that. And then the ocean was right there. And sometimes I'd go out on the rocks that jetty out into the ocean, which was probably a little bit dangerous. And the windier, the better. So that's my earliest recollection of dancing pre any form of dance class, which I did participate in, starting when I was probably in about 6th grade and on and off. Still now I dance in classes and I dance outside in the wind.
And you call your spiritual home as Haiti, Haiti. What do you mean by spiritual home and why Haiti?
Why Haiti is an interesting question because I think we would have to ask Haiti that in some ways. Haiti is the Creole pronunciation for Haiti, the Creole name, Ayti. Of course, Haiti is how we say it in English. And from dance, I'll just share that as I explored dance, I explored modern dance, different forms of modern dance, none of which I was ever very good at. And because I'm much more of a free dancer, I was in one Dunham technique class at the Clark Center in New York City in the 80s. And Catherine Dunham, of course, developed her technique after experiencing Haitian dance in Haiti, Haitian folkloric dance. And I was in this class, and at the end of the class, this elderly woman was standing in the corner, and she beckoned me over, and she told me, she said, "You should try traditional Haitian dance. That's what's in your body." And I got really annoyed because I heard it as "You're not very good at this dance form," which was true. And as I walked out, some of the other dancers says, "What did she say to you? What did she say to you?" And I think I grunted something, and they're like, "That's Catherine Dunham. What did she say to you?" And I said, "She told me to do Haitian traditional dance." So I did. And I was actually leaving New York very shortly. So I went to one class in New York City and loved it. And then years later, I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I now currently live, and found out maybe in my first week here that there was a Haitian dance class, and I went to it, and I was home. I was home in the dance form, and it was just a recognition of my own body. I would say for a dance class, it was as close to the free form movement that I loved to do as a child in terms of the feeling of liberation and recognition. And so I became very interested in Haiti, and I traveled there when I was getting my degree in dance movement therapy to do my thesis research. I just went down there. My husband accompanied me, and we explored and started to make connections. And that was 1998. And I have been going to Haiti ever since. Haiti ever since. I lived there in 2004, set up a program for survivors of organized violence, have gone back and forth as a consultant, everything from local, very organic nonprofits down there to working with the U.S. Embassy. And when I was living there in 2004, I was adopted by a mambo. So a mambo is the Creole term for, I'm going to call her a medicine woman, a healer. I went to a fête vaudou, which is in English, we would say a voodoo ceremony. Voodoo is an extremely incorrect pronunciation. It's vaudou.
How do you spell that?
Vodou. And it's important because voodoo, of course, has been blasphemized. I don't know if that's a word. It's been Hollywoodized, which is never a good thing. I've seen places that sell voodoo donuts, and I just saw a movie the other day where one of the lines was, "Don't do your voodoo on me." It's been completely, it made into a very negative thing. Vodou is a beautiful tradition that really talks about our relationship with the unknown. It comes from, I think, in what's now Benin. I don't know how you'd say it. Va. It means God, to be like in the presence of God. So I was invited to some ceremonies, and the second time I was there, this extraordinary elderly woman who I now know was one of Haiti's fiercest mambos and most beloved took me under her wing immediately and adopted me. And I was initiated in 2004 into the tradition and have gone through many layers of initiation there, many levels. And so that's my spiritual home. I carry that tradition and practice it. And it's quite humbling, especially in today's world where we're finally reckoning in the United States, white supremacy, and looking at issues like appropriation. It's very humbling to be so intimate with, so deeply connected to a tradition that I love dearly. And I have many Haitian family through spirit who encourage me to be open about it, to teach the songs, to teach what I know of the tradition. I continue to go down there and lead dances and ceremony and support my community because it's a communal tradition in many ways. Haven't been able to go since COVID started, really. I was there right before COVID. I was there in January of 2020 and really longing to go back. So that's why it's my spiritual home.
I have a lot of follow-up questions on this.
Okay.
What is the purpose of these ceremonies?
So Vodou has many forms in a sense. It is a tradition that has emerged from the traditional dances and rhythms and songs and practices of the enslaved people who were taken from their homelands on the continent. It's called, Africa. The continent is, in my understanding, a more appropriate way to refer to it. Vodou is an amalgam of those practices. And there's also of those, all of those aspects of the traditions that were brought over. There's also a Haitian specific set of rhythms and dances, the Petwo, that was born around the same time. When I say born, that emerged around the same time that there was a ceremony in Bois Caïman. It was August 14th, and I think it was 94. I think I might have it's 1790. I think it was 4. I don't always remember exact dates. And that's when the Petros spirits appeared. Loa, they're called, and birthed this whole body of dance and rhythms that are particularly Haitian. So ceremonies, which are based on these spirits, the spirits that have come over from the continent, or the Haitian spirits, happen for many reasons. I could, in a very simple sense, say many of us go to church to pray, or go to mosque to pray, or we pray 5 times a day. We have our prayer rug. Ceremonies it's divination. It's how we commune and connect with the spirits who are emissaries for God. So in our tradition, the spirits are actually representatives of people who have once lived. So they actually reflect once living beings. And that's how their purpose and pathway is defined or identified. And so we call the spirits in. So at different times of year, there are different ceremonies. So for example, November 1st is coming up, the Gede ceremonies, Feast of the Yams in Mailaku, which is Laku Jizu in the north part of Haiti. There will be many ceremonies for this particular spirit. The Gede spirits are the ones who dwell in the cemetery, veil between worlds, life and death, and there's many things I could say about them. Ceremonies can also be done, for example, there's something called Kasai Kanari, which is when somebody has passed. So there's one done shortly after they passed, and then another ceremony done a year and a day later. And that is to ensure that their spirit gracefully and with ease transfers from their body to Guinea-Basdlo, which is literally refers to all those enslaved people who died in the Middle Passage. It means Guinea, which is this ancestral homeland for Haiti. Guinea refers to a part of the continent that was once called Guinea based on tribal movements. So it means Guinea underneath the sea. And it's the place of ancestors. And then the Kasai Kanari that happens a year and a day later is to set the spirit free. That's a lot of information, but there's so many reasons so there's regular ceremonies that happen every year. And then there's ceremonies that will happen for a death or for a healing, something, or for an initiation. There was a ceremony when I was initiated.
As a listener to this podcast, I'm wondering that what is the outcome of these ceremonies? You mentioned initiation, healing. Can you describe on initiation and what kind of healing we can achieve through all these ceremonies? If somebody is in India or if somebody is in US or in any part of the world, how can we conduct these ceremonies? I know I've asked you a couple of questions.
So first of all, initiations, as in many of the deep and ancient spiritual traditions, we can't talk about the details. It's very internal. It's very private. There are certain aspects of tradition that's only kept for those carrying the tradition. And then there are things that are more broadly shared. And I believe deeply in my heart that honoring that is essential so that I do not appropriate. I honor the way the practices are observed and carried. I will say that in the initiation process, there's an Tikai Mystere. It means a little mystery house. There's an inner chamber, if you will, where there's a lot of things going on that are not visible to anybody else but those there. And then there's a ceremony which consists of drummers and dancers and singers, and depending again upon the geography, like where it is, many of the ceremonies in the south of Haiti are very different than in the north. They'll call the spirits in a particular order, calling the spirits as the dancers dance, and it's ritual, right? Ritual is repetition and dancing in a circle and changing directions. And the drummers drum. The spirits are called down, and the word that we use in English is possession. So if a person gets possessed, that spirit is communing with that individual is creating space in their body for that spirit to inhabit temporarily. And the spirit will give many messages. So that's part of the healing. It's often messages. It's often what the spirit says or how the spirit moves. And the mambo or the ungon, the male is the ungon, will interpret what might need to be interpreted. But healing, in terms of healing, ceremonies, it's just prayer. It's a Haitian ceremony, a fête vaudou is moving prayer. It's how we pray. It's how we invite God, and this may not resonate with many people's religion, so I hope it's not offensive, but it's how we invite God to be very immediately present in our lives. The loas, which are the intermediaries between the humans and God, will actually inhabit our bodies. So we can pray for any kind of healing. We can pray for something collective, like I'm just thinking of when was it? Maybe May or June, when India was just ravaged by the Delta variant. A ceremony could be conducted to pray, to bring some sense of ease. It's not the miracle cure. It's not, okay, certainly we can pray for that, all of us, in whatever our tradition is. Pray for the strength, pray for the support of the people there. I'm a strong believer in prayer. I think it moves energies in a way that can bring any kind of healing that we desire for those we care about, for those we love, for those we tend to. So I know that was a broad answer.
I love it. Can you share a personal story from your life when you conducted any kind of ceremony to provide healing or initiation?
They're always co-conduct. Ceremonies are a communal affair. So I am actually, my spiritual mother Manchun trained me, and I actually could and will conduct ceremonies. I have always participated with her. She died in 2008. So I've been to many ceremonies since then. So I will have a part to play. Sometimes I lead the dance. Sometimes I help with some of the preparation. There are preparatory ceremonies that happen before the public ceremony. What I would like to share is actually a ceremony where I was offered healing, because I actually think it's a pretty remarkable story. So I left Haiti, I think it was the very end of 2004, just before 2005. There had been a big funding shift, as often happens with international funding, US government funding. And I didn't want to come home at all, and it was pretty devastating. And I have a history of motor vehicle accidents and some injuries that have accumulated in my body. And it was the second time in my life where my back completely went out. It went into this it wasn't just a muscle spasm. I had herniated some discs. I think I even had a rupture. So my back was I was just in a lot of pain. And I think some of it was history, being injured, but it was also when we have those layers of stress, being forced to leave Haiti and not wanting to, because I loved being there. So I was back in New Mexico. That's when we moved to New Mexico. And my back wasn't getting better. And I had an MRI here at the hospital. And my doctor looked at me, he was like, whoa, I can't even believe you're walking. And I couldn't walk up hills. I couldn't dance. And they sent me to Denver to the Rose Clinic, I think is what it was called. It was one of the big hospitals up there. They said, we don't have what you need here in New Mexico to see this top neurosurgeon. So I had the appointment maybe a month or two out. I had already planned a trip to Haiti, and I went to Haiti, hunched over, not walking so well. My friend picked up in Port-au-Prince. She was very worried about me. I remember standing downtown, and there was a protest starting, and there were some tanks in the street. There was some violence cropping up. This was before all the kidnappings started. I remember I couldn't run. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be very challenging to be here in the state. I flew to the North Coast to see my spiritual mother, Manchun. Walked up to her house, which was very rural, very remote. She took one look at me and my friend who dropped me off, and she said, "You're staying here for 3 days." And we didn't have one of the communal gatherings it's called the peristyle, which is the space that the actual ceremonies happen in. But she put a bed with all white bedding on it in the peristyle room. I was dressed in all white, and I laid in the bed for 3 days while she did ceremony in the form of prayer. So there's many ways that we do ceremony or ritual in this tradition. And she gave me permission to talk about this. And I was tended to and taken care of, and she would not let me get up except when I had to go to the bathroom or something like that. And on my last night there, she was doing a lot of prayer. She was up most of the night. So even though there wasn't drummers and dancers, there was a lot of energy moving. And that third night I was there, I had a dream, and there was a tall man, all dressed in white, with a long beard. I'm going to say like a Christ figure, darker skinned than the at least the U.S. Christian idea of Christ, darker skinned, olivey dark. But I just remember this striking figure with long gray hair, also a bit like a wizard. And he was standing at the foot of the bed, and he was talking to me something about children and stuff. And all of a sudden he yanked on my right leg, and it was my the subluxations and the injuries in my spine were on the right side. And that was where most of the horrible pain was. And I felt my hip pop. If you've ever had a chiropractic adjustment, but it was this big movement. And I woke up and I could walk perfectly fine. I had no pain, none at all. And my friend came to pick me up. And I told Manchu, and I got up in the morning, I was like, "Look at me." And she just smiled. She's, "Of course. What do you think I've been doing here for 3 days?" My friend couldn't believe it when I got back to Port-au-Prince. My friends were all like, "What happened to you? You're moving like you've always moved." So that was ceremony, and that's prayer, and very powerful. She died in 2008. I wish I had much more time with her. Skill, her devotion, her commitment is where her strength and power came from. I'm a far way away from that. It's challenging to be in the United States. I haven't been able to go to Haiti for about a year. I go as often as I can. I study in the ways that I can here. She's still very well known. She's a legacy in Haiti. So she was a very powerful healer, and she still is. She's in the ancestral realm now.
Where is Haiti located?
It is in the Caribbean. So if you know where Cuba is off the coast of Florida, if you go east, you've got in that direction, you've got Haiti. It's on the island of Hispaniola. Half of it, the eastern side, is the Dominican Republic. The western side is Haiti. Very close to Puerto Rico, Cuba, Jamaica's not very far. It's in that area. It's a little island.
Yes, and I would love for you to explore different aspects in our conversation. You are an innovator in the use of somatic psychology, ecosomatics, and movement-based therapies. So what is somatic psychology, if you could describe for our listeners?
Somatic psychology, I think the simplest way to describe it is body-based psychology. I think there's some interesting discussions going on now in somatics and what it is. And sometimes I feel very unsophisticated when people ask me that, but really it's body-based. It's the connection between body and mind, which has always been. But it's looking at it in a unified way. So it's not, we're now able to connect our body and our mind. It's the realization, it's the acknowledgement that it's always been.
What are the different practices in somatic psychology to provide healing for any sort of trauma?
When I went to school, actually, we had a little bit of education on trauma. There's much more now in schools of somatic psychology. I went to school in the 90s, so it wasn't really part of our education. And I wouldn't say that there's any traditional practices. I think how I'll answer this is that one of the things that we know from research on trauma, and especially on trauma and memory, is that the memory shards that contribute to our suffering are sensory motoric and image-based. They're implicit. They're not my ability to tell you about dancing when I was a little girl in a coherent narrative. These are bits of sensory motoric and image-based. I really think of them as shards that contribute to the memory of what happened, knowing that they're implicit, that they're in the body. Somatic psychology, I think, is rising up more and more as one of the most preferred practices or therapies for working with trauma. So there's so many different practices now and theories. Again, when I went to school, I am considered one of the innovators in working with somatic psychology and dance movement therapy, which is my specialization within somatic psychology in trauma. Doesn't mean that other people weren't doing it. And that's classifying it in this tradition, which is Western mental health based. I've co-collaborated with my clients because my clients are equally a part of it. A theoretical base. I actually call it the potomitan. It's a trauma and resiliency framework. Potomitan is Creole for the center post, which refers to the center of ceremony, the center of healing, intentionally named in Creole at the request of my Haitian family, not to appropriate, but to raise up the power of that tradition. So in that framework and in my work, which I call restorative movement psychotherapy or polyvagal informed dance movement therapy, which is the more emergent, more recent layer, I have a lot of practices that are, I'm going to call them structured, where I very intentionally work with the body's weight to promote grounding, or breath to promote neuroregulation, or the spine to open up pathways of interoception. So lots of different practices to promote opening pathways that will support a person's natural ability to heal, that will promote their resiliency and their restoration.
Love to get into the details of these modalities. And before that, I want to ask you about, how do you define trauma?
Exposure. Because I could go on way too long about how I define trauma. Exposure. So it's not the event, which we know from years of many brilliant somatic therapists. And it's often called what happens in the body. It's the exposure. I'm going to say it's an alchemical mix. And that might not be the right term because alchemy but it's a change that happens. I'm exposed to something that either is dangerous and creates fear, or life-threatening and creates terror. My emotional reaction is either fear or terror. And that's part of what I bring to the exposure. And then it's whatever the event is. So we're all different. So I always say, if there was 20 of us on the same bus and the bus starts to crash, that's the exposure. But the exposure is very refined by, am I in the front or the back of the bus? Have I had so many car accidents that I'm like, I've got this, I can see what's happening? Have I had so many car accidents that I go into a state of complete mobilization and fear? There's so many variables in that moment of exposure that start with, do I have bad cramps that day? Did I just flunk a test? Did I just have a fight with my partner? And am I getting the flu? So I'm a little bit down. Or did I pass my test? Did I get my dream job? Did I just get married? All those things that shift our mood. It's our state. What's our physiological and psychological state when we meet that moment of exposure, and everything that happens after. How do we react in the moment, or do we stay responsive, present? Nothing to do with intelligence, weakness, strength. It's just that unique combination of factors. And even if it's a very scary event for us and we feel rattled and shaken, if we get support immediately, we might not be traumatized. If we don't, we increase the likelihood.
When you work with clients in the realm of movement-based therapies, it can include dance, yoga, and different other modalities in the movement-based therapies. How do you take your client from point A to point B, and point B is healing, or to a point of healed?
I use the term restoration. And in fact, I think honestly that I may have coined that term in this context. When I went to school, people talked about healing, which is a beautiful word. Healing also tends to be a bit loaded with the idea of pathology, that there's an illness or something's wrong. I think it's changing, but I also don't really believe in healers I reject the idea of anyone having that much power to heal somebody else. I think of it as a restorative process. And I started using that term in the very early 2000s. And it's interesting because now a lot of people in the trauma field talk about restoration. My use of language is very specific. We restore the aspects of a person's life, the important things that we can, to promote more belonging and meaning making. I really think about it in terms of restoring as much of a sense of belonging and meaning as possible. The pathways for how we get there depends upon what my client presents with. Is it chronic pain? Is it flashbacks? Is it an inability to be intimate in relationships?
What is flashback?
People. Flashback. A flashback is when, if I was in a flashback right now and we had our cameras on, you could see me, but I would be in the moment of exposure. It's when somebody actually lives the memory. They relive the memory of what happened over again. They're very uncomfortable to witness because it looks very dissociative, to use a clinical term. The person's no longer there. Yeah, it's when somebody actually relives the experience and as if they are there. And it could be 2 days ago or 25 years ago that whatever happened. It's a very intense reliving of the experience. Yeah, so I think of it in terms of restoration, and that acknowledges that there is no full recovery. So I reject the term trauma recovery. We don't get everything back. It's life-changing. It is a ripple, a stone thrown in the pond of our life that is going to continue to ripple. And some of those ripples may continue to be uncomfortable, hopefully less and less so, hopefully not interfering with our sense of meaning and belonging, or interfering much less. And some ripples might be quite transformative and might open up new discoveries about ourselves.
How do you feel about getting to a place where we are at peace and we have acceptance about whatever happened in the past? Do you think it is restoration?
Yes, that's restoration. The past becomes the past. We acknowledge it as something that happened. It doesn't mean that we don't have moments of heartbreak over the injustice, the suffering, everything that goes with that. It's an integration of knowing that the past is the past and we're here now and are able to, some people would say, restore function. I would say live with a sense of our meaning and purpose and dignity in a way that's shaped and informed and colored by that experience, but isn't held captive to it.
And under the umbrella of movement-based therapies, you have other subcategories such as polyvagal informed therapy, the untamed body moving therapy.
Oh.
Can you describe these terms? What is polyvagal theory and what is untamed body moving therapy?
So this is my website. You're looking at my website. And part of it is I have this beautiful, amazing, I'm going to call her an assistant colleague who helped me with my website. We were trying to categorize my work because I do straight up clinical work. By that, I have a therapy practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico for refugees and survivors of torture. And they know that they're coming to a counselor, a mental health professional. I lead retreats. I call them wild Zenness retreats out in nature where we might be at an eco resort. We might be doing something called Continuum, which is a movement practice created by Emily Conrad that I teach. That's very, I'm going to call it very primal in sense of primary, getting close to our origins. I teach yoga. I don't teach yoga as much. I used to teach yoga a lot in the 80s and 90s. I teach more adaptations of it. So all those categories refer to like bodies of work within my body of work. I don't know how else to say it. So polyvagal informed dance movement therapy is really the current iteration of what I used to call restorative movement psychotherapy. I met Dr. Stephen Porges in 1999 and we're friends, and I've had the great blessing of a lot of collegial idea sharing with him, and that and my clients, when people say, oh, I've created this framework, I find that arrogant because it doesn't get created without your clients. Who's bringing the courage? So it's a co-collaboration. And so the work has been deeper and deeper, or more deeply refined by my very deepening understanding of the polyvagal theory, which I'll just say that the first time, that's Steve's work, polyvagal theory. The first time I heard him speak, I was like, there is something here that is so essential for my work with survivors of torture.
He is one of the pioneers in this trauma.
He's brilliant. And it was 1999, and I asked him a question about something he shared about social engagement. And he asked for specification because I was thinking about my torture surviving clients. And when I said I work with survivors of torture, he said, meet me at the break. Let's talk. And that started our friendship. So,
Could you describe more about that conversation if you remember?
oh, I think I've shared what I remember. That was 1999. We talked, and I told him what I was observing in survivors. And I said, their exposure occurs in intimate relationship. Being tortured is uncomfortably intimate. And I'm broadening the definition of intimacy, obviously. And sadistic abusers, sadistic torturers get to know their victims very intimately, because if you're sadistic, I'm not saying you, but if one is sadistic, they get off on the pain of another. So there's a very empathic connection there. Empathy gets exploited in service of cruelty with sadistic abuse. And so the conversation probably had something to do with that. And so the work that I call polyvagal informed dance movement therapy, which is, I might say it's a very specific branch of my overall looking at restorative movement psychotherapy. It's the integration of his research into the work. It's how it shows up in the body and working with movement and dance. I actually am writing a book now. I have a contract to write with Norton, who Steve and Deb Dana write with. And so I'm writing a book very much at my dear friend Deb Dana's encouragement on polyvagal informed somatic psychology and dance movement therapy. So I'm working. So all of this is going to be fleshed out in that book. I think you asked me about the conversation.
Polyvagal theory and the conversation.
The untamed body those are my retreats. That refers to work that I do that's not cast or contained in a clinical context. Retreats. Continuum is a movement practice created by Emily Conrad. Actually, she spent 5 years, 55 to 60, living in Haiti. And she would always say to me, that's where it was born. That's where the seed was planted. She also was an initiate in the tradition, which is part of how we came to know each other. And it's recognition that the human body, like the earth, is 70 to 80% water, and that we are movement. We don't do it. We are it. And that it's very mutable and fluid. And so she did extraordinary research in the laboratory of her own body, and then working with others in how actually looking at the fluid body, which isn't one place, we are mostly water, as an alternative system, and how sound and micro movements can, I'm going to say, ignite movement in the fluid body, and how we can actually move much more organically, like we're truly meant to move. So a lot of my untamed body is unpatterning, depatterning, getting out of the fetch wood, carry water. Emily would say, we sit at a computer all day. We start to hunch over. We sit in the car. We know how to turn the car on. We know how to pull the pan out and put the butter in it. That's not all we're here to do. We have evolution in service of evolution. We have, who knows, if we start to really work with our breath and sound is breath made audible and start to move freely, who knows how we might adapt. There's a lot of intelligence in the body's ability to be fluid.
And there are many modalities, you can say healing modalities or restorative modalities these days, such as psychedelics, breathwork, sound healing. And now we are talking about movement-based therapies. So what is the benefit of movement therapy as compared to other modalities? And as a listener, if I want to know, should I go for movement therapy or should I go for different sort of therapy? So where should I go, Amber?
So I think every single type of therapy, I'm very interested in psychedelics. I want to learn more about it. I've been attending some classes on it. I don't think there's one, and I know this is not what you asked, there's not one that's better than the other. I think it's similar to what I said about trauma and exposure. What's going to help me meet my own moment of restoration? There may be times in one person's life where movement is going to be the most effective or the most helpful. Some people hear dance movement therapy and they're like, no way. Like they just get the idea of dance and they're like, I don't dance. And so that might be a little intimidating. And I always say to people, every movement begins with a breath. Every dance begins with movement. That's why I use a lot of structured movement and I call it dance therapy. There are some dance movement therapists who might not agree with me. There are some who are quite committed to dance therapy being much more how it was in the 40s and 50s, which was very modern dance-based, but I think we have to be adaptive. So I think it has to do with what would help us in the moment? If people are in a lot of physical pain, movement therapy might not be helpful. Although I work with a lot of physical pain and I work with breath and the imagination and things like that, visualizations. But as little as I know about psychedelics, I feel like the plants have so much intelligence. They have so much medicine. They are wisdom keepers. They're our rooted planet mates. So they have tremendous healing to offer.
I really like
Yeah,
how you describe this, that
yeah.
there is no one size fit all.
No.
There are many ways to work on healing, and it all varies from one phase to another phase in our life. Things will change. If dance movement is working at this phase, it may not work when we are 60, 70, 80 years.
And it might work better when we're older. I'll just share my mother who recently passed. Her generation didn't do a lot of therapy, but at the end of her life, she wanted some support. She was my dad's caregiver in COVID, and she sought help from a dance movement therapist because she attended some of my classes online. She was, oh my goodness, it's so much more potent than just talking. And she was in her 90s. There's so many ways to adapt it. And there's times where talk therapy is limited. There's times where that's the most helpful thing. People need to talk through something. Dance movement therapy, by the way, includes a very strong verbal component. It's not just moving. We have very attuned verbal skills and ability to help people construct narratives, because that's what we human beings like to do. We like to construct a narrative. We like to know what our story is. So we connect it to words. I've also noticed that people go through phases. So I will work with a lot of people who will say, I've done as much as I can in talk therapy. I want to work with my body. And they can equally say, you know what? I've done as much as I can with movement. I've really become interested in sound or music, or I want to go into poetry therapy. I want to start writing. So I think it's quite brilliant and helpful to work through a continuum of, nobody has to be with the same therapist their whole life.
What is narrative exposure therapy? This term I found in your work, narrative exposure therapy.
Oh, I was just looking at Neuner, Neuner. Why can't I? Is it Frank? I don't want to say. There's 3 people. There's a book on narrative exposure therapy, and he's one of the names on the book. When I don't have books in front of me, it's a form of therapy. I may not know. I'm trained in it, but I'm not a trainer of it. So I don't know it as deeply as a trainer. Based on, it draws from Michael White's narrative therapy from Adelaide, Australia. It's an exposure-based therapy. And they used it and researched its efficacy in Uganda in refugee camps, and it was very powerful there. I was trained in it in the United States because many of us working with refugees or asylum seekers or survivors of torture started exploring it because of its, I'm going to use the word success in Uganda. It's not, I don't believe it's shown up as well in the research here. And I think there's many reasons for that, but it's a very time-contained, time-limited process where you do deep exposure based on what they call a lifeline, where you actually help a person mark their whole life, actually with props. You actually use a piece of yarn and find of the memories that are, because again, memory is at the base of those shards, those implicit shards that are at the base of states of traumatization. Identify the ones, they call them the hottest, which means they're the ones in my language that keep us captive, hold us captive. And then you work very in depth, and the person will share those memories in very intense detail.
Would you consider journaling as a way to process trauma and memories?
Absolutely. Both written journaling, and I think there's many ways to journal. But I often have my students journal, and I journal myself. I think it's very powerful.
What are the different ways of journaling, according to you?
There's writing journaling. There's writing about in a structured way about particular events or things. There's free form, sort of free association, just journaling, riffing off of nature or something. I think we carry stories in our bodies, body narratives and stories. So I think we can choreograph stories, and that's journaling, body journaling. I don't do that as much anymore. I used to do that many years ago, but actually just creating a dance can be like a journal. A journaling. Since our body is, right? It's a book of experience.
I like to process through free flow writing, free flow journaling.
That's what I tend to do, yes.
And going back to movement-based therapy, what challenges do you face while working with refugees? and your other clients?
There's often challenges in therapy because many working with a very diverse cross-section of humanity, of our planetary neighbors. Many people aren't contextualized in terms of therapy. I've had many people who wouldn't normally do therapy back home. They'd have many different approaches to restoration or healing. In terms of challenges, I don't think therapy in the way that it's done in the West is right for everybody. And I'm just really starting to try to operationalize how I've adapted to working, because I've only ever worked with this community. I often contextualize it in terms of support. I have to do a lot of psychoeducation, psychosocial education. Often the first weeks or months of therapy might be teaching people what therapy is so that it benefits them. Otherwise, why bother?
Can you describe in brief what therapy is?
Can I describe what therapy is?
Yes.
Oh, that's a big question. I'm thinking of the word therapeutic. So I'm going to answer the question in terms of, I can only answer it in terms of what I do.
Please.
Therapy. And I am a supportive presence who listens more than I talk. I listen. I reflect, I connect, I help guide my clients to make connections between their physiology and their emotions and their cognitions, their physiology and their connections. We might translate that into movement. We might translate it into journaling. We might talk about it. We might pray about it. I am open and adaptive to the practices that support them. To heal, if that's the term they use. Restore, that's the term I like to use. Problem solve. Sometimes people have very specific things they want to work on. How to meet people. How to learn English better because they've had so many traumatic brain injuries. Whatever it is. But that's how I would describe how I work.
Thank you for explaining. You are a champion for self-care and self-compassion practices. So I would love to know, what are your practices on a day-to-day basis?
Water. I live in a desert. I'm so blessed to have a little hot tub outside that I saved up for a long time. I start every morning in the water when I'm home because I can't be. If I'm anywhere near an ocean, I'm either walking in the ocean or walking in the ocean, walking along the edge of the ocean or in the water. I have to be in water every day. And here, especially because we have 4 seasons, I often get in and I like to pretend I'm a dolphin and I roll around. I feed birds. I have just huge joy in feeding birds. It's something that I've been doing for the last maybe 5 years. We've had a drought out here. So we've had a lot of actually large scale bird deaths. So I get to sit in the water in the morning with a cup of coffee and watch the birds. And that is... Because to me, self-care is practicing self-compassion, and self-compassion is reminding myself how much I love myself and how much gratitude I have for being here in the world and showing my gratitude for the world and all its beings. So anything to do with my dogs is self-care. Like this, the next thing I'm doing today is meeting a very beloved friend with our dogs and going for a walk along a beautiful ravine. I dance, movement and dance. It's been hard during COVID, but I love to dance. My favorite dance class in the world is here. My beloved teacher, Elise Gent, that was the Haitian dance class that I took in the, 1990, when I felt that I was home. So I still go to that class. But actually, one of the things that I do champion is that self-care, it's not a thing that we do at a certain time. It is every day, but it's also a thread that we weave through every breath, every step, every moment. So it might be caring for myself enough that I adjust my posture in a way that I'm sitting very differently in the middle of a session. And a client might notice it. That might sound silly, but some people, I've noticed that some therapists still work like we have to sit still. We shouldn't move too much, have a neutral face. I'm a little more human than that. If I need to stand up and stretch, I will say to a client, do you mind if I just stand up for a moment? I just have to stretch a little bit and then sit back down. I don't keep a neutral face. I'm not so expressive that I don't want to be so expressive that my client's concerned about me, but I've shed a few tears. I call it the kind face. It's about 12 years ago, a colleague and I came up with the kind face campaign. How do we train our faces to be kind? It can be taking that drink of water, like taking 30 seconds to take a drink of water or a little bit of extra energy to go outside the building where my office is and just close my eyes and feel the sun on my eyelids. Just for a moment. I think about clearing my vision. Things like that. Very small practices are really important. And I think that's what self-compassion is.
Absolutely. You have been blessed to work with some amazing collaborators such as Stephen Porges and other mystics and medicine people in Australia, Nepal, Guatemala, United States. Can you describe what did you learn after working with those mystics, medicine people? And what is medicine people?
Medicine people, I don't know what term to use. I like you said mystics. Yeah, I like that. I don't know what term to use. I don't use the term shaman because shaman very specifically that comes from that Siberian migration. Shamanism is very specific and it's so overused. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where people literally have business cards that say they're a shaman. And I'm very suspicious. So I say medicine person. I hope that's not appropriation. I know that's used in Native American tradition, but my sense is it's a broad enough term, somebody who carries medicine. Mystic, actually, I like that. A mystic. That's even a more general term, and I like that better. The older, more traditional cultures, the wisdom is held in so many cultures that have retained their sense of connection to the earth and to the ancestors. I joke in a lot of my trainings, the United States is considered the most egocentric culture in the world. It really should be called an egocentric society because we are comprised of so many cultures, many of whom are deeply sociocentric. Our Native American community, our Hispanic or Latinx community, depending upon how they wish to be defined. The descendants of those who were enslaved come from the continent where there's a very strong sense of community, being in relationship. My sense of self does not end at my skin. It's my ancestors. It's my family. It's the plant world. It's the planets. I think all of that, and I actually just lost the thread that what were you asked me about?
That
Medicine
what did you
people.
learn?
Medicine
What did you
people.
learn
Yeah.
from mystics, medicine people?
Yeah, sorry. So that's what I've learned. So I'm talking about what I've learned. I think that's where I have come to understand the wisdom of how connected we are to everyone. And I don't just mean people. I'm rooted, winged, I mean finned, two-legged, all the plant nations and fish nations and animal nations. We're so connected. And that's one of the many things I've learned. I've also learned how to listen. I'm not sure how to unpack that, but how to listen, not like reflective listening, but to how to listen, how to be present with a level of stillness and that shows respect, where my whole body is engaged in what the person or persons or being I am with is saying or moving or offering.
Thank you for explaining, Amber. And it seems to me the right time and right place to wrap up this conversation. Do you think we should have explored something else that you want to share? Anything you want to share with us?
No, you have such wonderful questions, and I feel like we've gone in so many directions. What I'm sensing now is how important it all is. If we've ever had a relative, a grandmother, grandfather who said, trust your gut, trust your intuition, that's so important right now. I've been really thinking about the importance of interoception. That's a term that has been around for many years, but is getting more popularized. Our inner knowing, 80% of the information that travels the vagus nerve to the brain travels from the belly up, from the dorsal pathway up to the ventral. Only 20% is brain down. That's a very simplistic way to describe it. But to me, what that says is our deepest wisdom is inside of us, right? It's in that deep intuitive belly brain. So I'm encouraging people to get to know that, to listen, to trust. Trust can be hard for many people for so many reasons, but to learn to listen to ourselves.
And last but not the least, where can people find you online?
My website is www.ambergray.com. Yeah, there's quite a bit of information there. It's about 5 years old, so it might get another update because I'm noticing websites now have like hardly any words on it, but there's fair amount of information. It is where I update all my classes. Everything is there. I've got a Facebook page, Amber Gray Movement Therapies. I've got an Instagram too that I never use, but I think it's Restorative Resources.
All the links. I will put all the links in the show notes.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you so much, Amber. It has been a great conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nishant.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast, or you can visit https://nishantgarg.me, NISHANTGARG.me. You can also share this episode with your loved ones to help them live a fulfilled life. You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, and these practices help me in living a resilient life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. You are doing the best you can. And thank you so much again.